Jasmine Williams had always prided herself on leading a quiet, unassuming life. The kind of life where the mundane moments and everyday routine grounded her, made her feel like a part of something bigger. As a woman of color, growing up in a city where tensions between communities and law enforcement simmered beneath the surface, Jasmine had always known the importance of staying out of the spotlight. She was a private person, focused on her work and her family. Little did she know that on a seemingly ordinary morning, her life would change forever. It was a crisp autumn day when Jasmine left her apartment, heading out for her usual 9 a.m. shift. The sun barely peeked through the clouds as she walked to her car, the familiar sound of her shoes clicking against the pavement the only noise in the quiet streets. She wasn't in a hurry, she had no reason to be. Her day would follow the same routine as always, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary would unfold. Her job as the head of internal affairs was demanding, and it required a level of precision and diplomacy few people could comprehend. But today, as she drove through the bustling city streets, everything seemed calm, almost serene. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect day. Jasmine loved her work. She had spent years rising through the ranks, climbing the professional ladder, earning her place at the top of internal affairs. Yet, her colleagues didn't see her as the powerful, influential figure she truly was. To them, she was just another face in the office, a woman who did her job well, but not someone they necessarily noticed. They didn't know she was the head of internal affairs, tasked with overseeing the most sensitive cases involving police misconduct. Jasmine had kept that part of her life private, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood the power of anonymity in a job like hers. Her true role in the city's law enforcement world was a well-kept secret. As she drove, her thoughts drifted, thinking about the usual cases she had been working on. The department was rife with tension, plagued by internal corruption, racial discrimination, and systemic issues that no one seemed to want to address. It wasn't easy to change a system so deeply entrenched in the ways it had always been. Jasmine had seen firsthand how some officers bent the rules, manipulated situations to their advantage, and targeted certain communities with impunity. She had become a silent guardian, working behind the scenes to expose those who thought they were untouchable. The pressure was immense, but she carried it without complaint. Her car hummed along the road, taking a familiar route. She passed by the old diner where she had grabbed coffee on early mornings, the park where she walked her dog on weekends, and the corner store that always had the freshest produce. She passed all these places like clockwork, as if they were markers of the life she had built, a life where routine was her anchor. Yet, even as she passed each familiar sight, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the universe had shifted slightly, and she was heading into an unknown chapter of her life. As she made her way down Fifth Avenue, her phone buzzed in her bag, and she glanced at the notification. A text from her best friend, Kayla, popped up. "Hey, you got a second? Something's happening at the station. You might want to check it out." Jasmine frowned and quickly replied, asking for more details. But the text came back with nothing but a string of emojis, an odd combination of a police badge, a question mark, and a fire emoji. Jasmine's curiosity piqued, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She was already running a bit late. At that moment, Jasmine saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. It was the kind of sight that, at the time, didn't seem out of place. She glanced in the mirror, the red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-soaked asphalt. A quick glance at her speedometer confirmed she wasn't speeding. So, when the officer's sirens blared, she was taken aback. What was the reason for the stop? It didn't make sense. She glanced to the side, noting that she hadn't been swerving or breaking any laws. She pulled over, unsure of what was happening. The officer stepped out of his car and approached her vehicle. Jasmine took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever was about to unfold. She rolled down her window, trying to maintain a calm, composed demeanor. She had dealt with more than her fair share of rude, dismissive officers in the past, and she knew how to handle the situation without escalating things. But the moment the officer reached her window, she saw his face, and something in his eyes made her pause. "License and registration," Officer Garrett said, his tone flat, devoid of the typical professional courtesy she was accustomed to. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming in the dim morning light. His eyes, however, seemed to have a coldness to them, a judgmental glare that was all too familiar to Jasmine. "Of course," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. She reached into the glove compartment and handed over her documents, keeping her eyes on him the entire time. There was something about him that felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She noticed his nameplate, Officer Garrett. Before he took the documents from her hand, scanning them quickly. "Where are you headed?" Garrett asked, barely looking up from the papers. "I'm on my way to work," Jasmine replied, the answer simple, yet it seemed to irritate him. He glanced at her once more, his gaze lingering a little too long on her face. "You seem like you're in a rush," Garrett remarked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're not speeding, but I'm sure you know how these things work. Just a routine stop. Hold tight." Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He didn't speak to her like an ordinary driver, but more like someone he could intimidate or control. The judgment in his eyes was palpable. She tried to remain calm, even as the situation started to make her feel uncomfortable. It wasn't uncommon for police officers to act like this, especially in certain areas of the city, but this felt different. This officer was behaving as if he had something to prove. A few minutes passed, and Garrett finally returned to her window. But instead of handing her back the documents, he threw a question her way that caught her off guard. "You're not hiding anything, are you? Maybe some weapons? Drugs?" His tone was accusatory, and his eyes scanned her with a look that made her skin crawl. The insinuation was clear, he was profiling her. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. "No," she said, her voice now edged with a firmness she couldn't conceal. "I'm just on my way to work. If you're done, I'd like to get going." Garrett's smirk faded, replaced by a more challenging look. "I'm not sure about that. You don't look like someone who'd be on the up and up. We're gonna need to have a little chat, ma'am." Jasmine's patience was waning. But she had learned over the years that sometimes, the best course of action was to stay calm and not engage in further conflict. But this officer wasn't done. He continued to push, asking intrusive questions, making veiled threats. Jasmine had seen this before, the feeling of being targeted just for who she was. It was only when Garrett began to demand she step out of the car that she made her decision. She wasn't going to let this go. Not today. Not when he had crossed a line. "Officer Garrett," she said, her voice steady, though a fire was starting to ignite inside her. "I need you to listen to me carefully. I am Jasmine Williams, head of internal affairs for the city's police department. I oversee cases just like yours." Garrett froze, his smirk dropping. He blinked, seemingly stunned. He didn't expect this. He had no idea who she was, what her role in the department entailed. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his mind racing to process what she had just revealed. Then, it hit him, he had been caught. The arrogance in his posture faltered, and the earlier sense of control he thought he had was slipping away. Ma'am, Garrett stammered, his confidence evaporating. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She was done being silent. "You're right," she said, her voice cold. "It is a routine stop. And now, we'll make sure it's handled the right way." As Jasmine sat back in her car, her pulse racing but her resolve hardening, she realized that the confrontation that had just transpired would be the catalyst for something much larger than any one person. Her life was about to take a turn she couldn't predict, and this officer's misstep had unknowingly set the stage for a chain of events that would bring the very foundations of the city's police force into question. But for now, all she could do was watch as Officer Garrett retreated, his bravado gone, and wait for what would come next. Little did she know that what started as a routine traffic stop would soon unravel everything she had worked for, and more. Jasmine sat in her car, her hand still gripping the steering wheel as Officer Garrett hesitated for a moment before retreating to his patrol car. The moment felt suspended in time, like everything around her was moving in slow motion. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just another routine stop, it had escalated into something far bigger, something that was about to send shockwaves through the very heart of the police department. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. The mix of adrenaline and righteous anger was a potent combination. Her mind raced. Did he really think he could treat me this way? The racism, the profiling, it was all too familiar. Jasmine had grown up in a city where these kinds of interactions were common. The police had long been seen as an institution that protected its own, even when its officers broke the law. Jasmine, however, was part of the solution, not the problem. She had dedicated her career to exposing misconduct within the force, a career that had made her both a target and an asset. But today, the tables had turned. As she waited for Garrett to return, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. What did I expect? She had been working in internal affairs for years now, watching case after case of racial profiling, abuse of power, and systemic corruption come to light. She had learned the hard way that the police department wasn't a perfect institution. Far from it. She had witnessed firsthand how some officers saw themselves as above the law, how they manipulated their power to get away with actions that were, at best, unethical and, at worst, downright criminal. Jasmine had worked tirelessly to make sure those officers faced consequences, even if it meant making enemies. The truth was, being head of internal affairs was a lonely position. She was often vilified by both sides, those who saw her as a threat to their unchecked power, and those who didn't believe that someone like her could be trusted to make real change. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Garrett's footsteps approaching once again. This time, his demeanor was different, there was no bravado in his stride, no smug sense of superiority. He was walking slowly, cautiously, almost like a man who knew he had crossed a line but didn't quite understand the full implications of what he had done. When he reached her window, he was no longer the confident officer from before. Instead, he looked like someone who had been caught off guard by a situation he didn't know how to handle. Garrett stammered, his voice shaky. I didn't know who you were. His tone was no longer filled with the aggression he had shown earlier. There was no mockery, no racial undertones in his voice. It was as though his entire worldview had been flipped upside down in a matter of seconds. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Jasmine didn't say anything right away. She kept her gaze locked on him, her expression cold. You're sorry? She thought. Sorry for what? For treating me like a criminal because of the color of my skin? She had heard that kind of apology before, empty, hollow words that meant nothing when the real issue had been ignored. She wasn't interested in hearing another one of his half-hearted apologies. She wasn't there for that. She wasn't going to let this moment slide. Officer Garrett, she said, her voice calm but firm, I want you to understand something. You don't get to decide who I am based on how I look. You don't get to treat me like I'm less than because of the color of my skin. You made an assumption about me, and it was wrong. And that assumption could have cost you your job. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His face reddened, and he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Jasmine could see the realization dawning in his eyes, that he had been caught. That he had misjudged the one person who was in the perfect position to expose him. You're right, Garrett muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look her in the eye anymore. Instead, he stared at the ground, his shoulders hunched as though trying to shrink into himself. Jasmine could see he was uncomfortable, but she wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. This wasn't about making him feel guilty, it was about holding him accountable. "I'm not going to make any excuses for you," she continued, her voice unwavering. "What you did was unacceptable. You targeted me because of who you assumed I was. Because of what you assumed I was. You're an officer of the law. You're supposed to uphold the principles of justice, not let your biases dictate your actions. If you want to apologize, it's not to me that you owe it. It's to the communities you've been sworn to protect." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Garrett didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. Jasmine knew this was a pivotal moment, one that would shape not only his future but hers as well. She had a choice to make. She could let the matter go, let the apology stand, and pretend it didn't happen. Or she could take action, hold him accountable, and bring attention to the systemic racism that still plagued the department. Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially not when it came to something as important as justice. "I'm going to file a report," she said, her voice resolute. "I'm going to make sure this is looked into, and I'll be reviewing your entire record. I don't know what you thought you could get away with today, but you made a mistake. And I won't let it slide." Garrett's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed to come to his senses. "Wait, no, please, don't do that," he pleaded, his voice desperate. "I didn't mean." "I don't want to hear it," Jasmine interrupted, her tone final. "You had the chance to do the right thing, and you chose to abuse your power. This is bigger than you and me. This is about the kind of police department we want to have. And I'm not going to stand by and let people like you continue to harm others." With that, Jasmine rolled up her window and pulled away, leaving Officer Garrett standing there, defeated and shaken. As she drove away, her mind raced. She hadn't expected things to escalate like this, but now that they had, there was no turning back. She was fully aware that what she had just done was going to cause waves. She could already feel the eyes of the department on her. And yet, there was a strange sense of relief in her chest. She had done the right thing. But as much as she had wanted to take the high road, Jasmine couldn't ignore the fact that her decision had consequences. What would happen now? Would Garrett be held accountable? Would the department back her, or would they sweep it under the rug? The thought of what was to come sent a shiver down her spine. But she wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. This was the world she had chosen to enter, a world where corruption and racism lurked just beneath the surface. And if she was going to make a difference, she would have to fight for it every step of the way. Jasmine arrived at the office a few minutes later, still processing everything that had happened. She couldn't shake the image of Garrett's face, the shame in his eyes. Part of her felt a twinge of sympathy, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. Sympathy wouldn't change anything. He had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. As she stepped into her office, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Kayla. "I'm hearing whispers. You sure you're ready for this?" Jasmine stared at the message for a moment before typing her response, "I'm ready. I've been ready for a long time." She hit send and sat back in her chair, knowing that the battle she had just begun would be one that would change everything. The following days passed in a blur for Jasmine. Her decision to file the report had sent ripples through the police department, and those ripples were quickly turning into waves. Word had spread quickly about the incident, though many of the details remained obscured. In the police world, whispers traveled fast, especially when someone in internal affairs was involved. Jasmine had already known that her position made her a target, but this felt different. She had always been the one who exposed the corruption, but now she had to face it head-on. The pressure was mounting. Every conversation she had seemed to be laced with tension. Her colleagues were divided. Some stood by her, fully aware of the weight of what she was doing and the potential fallout. They understood that systemic change required difficult decisions. But others? Others were skeptical, questioning why she had taken such a bold step, why she had decided to challenge an officer of the department. They didn't understand. They weren't used to seeing their own kind fall from grace. Jasmine's report about Officer Garrett wasn't just a claim of misconduct, it was an indictment of the system itself. And the system wasn't about to roll over and accept it. The phone calls started almost immediately. Some were from her superiors, asking for more details, probing her actions. They were careful with their words, but Jasmine could hear the underlying concern in their voices. She knew that they were weighing the potential fallout of her report, how it might affect the department's reputation, their bottom line, and their relationship with the community. They were worried about the scandal, not the truth. Others were less guarded. The calls from her friends in internal affairs were tinged with concern. They knew what she had done, and they knew what it could cost her. "Be careful, Jasmine," they warned her. "You've just opened a door you can't close. The higher-ups aren't going to forget this." Jasmine didn't care. She was in too deep now. There was no going back. It was on the third day after her report that the first unexpected twist hit. Jasmine was in her office, reviewing another case when she received a call from Kayla, her longtime colleague in internal affairs. Kayla was an old friend who had been in the department almost as long as Jasmine, and the two had been through many of the same struggles. Kayla had been the one who convinced Jasmine to join internal affairs in the first place, and she had always been Jasmine's sounding board when things got tough. "Jazz, you're not going to believe this," Kayla said, her voice tight with urgency. "What happened?" Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She could tell from Kayla's tone that something significant had shifted. "Garrett, he's been put on administrative leave. But that's not all. Word on the street is that they're looking at your report as just the tip of the iceberg. They're pulling his entire record, everything. They're going to make an example of him." Jasmine's stomach tightened. Make an example of him? For what? Kayla paused, then continued, "They're saying this could be bigger than just one bad officer. They think it could lead to a full-blown investigation into the department. And it's not just Garrett. They've started looking at the culture, how officers treat minorities, how they interact with the community. The pressure's building." Jasmine's mind raced. A full-blown investigation? She had never intended for things to escalate like this. She had filed her report to hold Garrett accountable, not to stir up a full-scale examination of the department's practices. But now that the lid was off, there was no way to shove it back on. "Who's leading the investigation?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Kayla hesitated. "I don't know yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if the chief himself gets involved. If this goes public, if the media gets hold of it, it could ruin everything." Jasmine could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about Garrett anymore. This was about everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to change. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built over the years, it was all on the line now. "Thanks, Kayla," Jasmine said, her voice tight. She ended the call and sat back in her chair, staring at the wall. What had she done? She had opened a door, and now there was no turning back. The next day, Jasmine received a call from her superior, Captain Harris. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, one of the few in the department who had supported her when she first took on the role of head of internal affairs. He was tough but fair, and Jasmine knew he wouldn't beat around the bush. "I read your report, Jasmine," Harris said, his voice clipped. "And I've had a chance to talk with Garrett. He's told his side of the story. We're looking into this, but I need you to understand something. This is big. Bigger than you realize. Jasmine took a deep breath. I understand. But this is about accountability. It's about doing what's right. I'm not disputing that, Harris replied, though his tone was tinged with something else, something Jasmine couldn't quite place. But you need to think about the consequences. The department's under enough scrutiny as it is. This could put us in a very difficult position. I don't care about the department's position, Jasmine shot back, her voice growing more heated. I care about what's right. And what Garrett did was wrong. If you're telling me to back down. No, Harris interrupted, his voice firm. I'm not telling you to back down. But I need you to consider the bigger picture. If this blows up, it could tear the whole department apart. We've worked hard to rebuild our reputation in the community. One bad apple shouldn't define all of us. Jasmine clenched her fists, the frustration rising inside her. She had heard this line of reasoning too many times before. The idea that protecting the department's reputation was more important than rooting out corruption. The idea that the system was more important than the people it was supposed to serve. I'm not backing down, Jasmine said, her voice resolute. I'm doing what's right. If that's too much for you, then maybe you should think about what kind of department you want to be a part of. Because I'm not in this for the politics. I'm in this to make a difference. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jasmine could hear Harris sigh, a heavy sound that seemed to echo in the silence. You're a good officer, Jasmine, he said quietly. I just hope you know what you're getting into. I do, Jasmine replied, her voice steady. I've known from the beginning. The conversation ended, and Jasmine was left with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She was in this alone. She had always known it would come to this, but now that she was in the thick of it, it felt more real than ever. There was no one she could rely on but herself. As she sat there, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, Jasmine couldn't help but think of the community, the people who had trusted her to fight for them. She thought of the families who had been wronged, the individuals who had been mistreated by officers who thought they were above the law. Jasmine knew that if she didn't stand firm now, if she didn't follow through on what she had started, she would be letting them down. She wasn't about to do that. Not now, not ever. The battle was far from over. The days that followed felt like an endless loop of uncertainty and tension. Jasmine couldn't escape the feeling that everything she had worked for was teetering on the edge of collapse. News of the internal investigation had leaked, and the whispers had turned into full-blown conversations. She walked through the department's halls with a sense of alienation. Her colleagues, once allies, now avoided eye contact, some glaring at her as though she had brought a plague into the precinct. The shockwaves of her report had spread far beyond Officer Garrett's actions, and the fallout was beginning to reveal just how deep the cracks in the department went. The pressure was suffocating. Jasmine tried to focus on her job, but her mind was constantly preoccupied with the consequences of her decision. She was already hearing rumblings about the potential for public protests, about media outlets looking to capitalize on the scandal. It wasn't just a police department at risk, it was the community's faith in the system, the trust between law enforcement and the people they swore to protect. Despite the mounting pressure, Jasmine's resolve only grew stronger. Every time she thought about the path she was walking, she remembered why she had started this journey in the first place. She was not some passive bystander, she was part of a system that was supposed to protect everyone, but the system was broken. She had seen firsthand the way officers, including Garrett, had used their badges to intimidate, harass, and abuse the power they had over marginalized communities. It wasn't just about one officer, it was about the whole institution. If she didn't speak up now, who would? It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the cost. However, as much as Jasmine was prepared to face the consequences of her actions, the backlash was proving to be worse than she had imagined. Officer Garrett, despite his suspension, had not gone quietly. His supporters within the department, some of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, were beginning to mobilize. At first, it seemed like small gestures, comments made in hushed voices, side glances, and subtle intimidation. But soon, it became apparent that Garrett wasn't the only one with something to lose. Jasmine's report had opened Pandora's box, and now there were people in high places who were determined to keep the lid firmly shut. One morning, as Jasmine sat in her office, going over another report, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, seeing that it was a text message from her old friend, Detective Marcus Jones. Marcus had been with her from the beginning of her time in internal affairs. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about what was happening within the department and had always been a quiet, steadfast ally. The text simply read, "We need to talk. It's urgent." Jasmine's stomach tightened. She knew Marcus well enough to understand that when he said something was urgent, it was serious. She quickly replied, telling him to meet her in her office in 10 minutes. The minutes crawled by, and when Marcus finally arrived, the look on his face told Jasmine everything she needed to know. He shut the door behind him and sat down across from her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Jazz, this is bigger than we thought," Marcus said, his voice low and tense. "I just got off the phone with someone from the mayor's office. They've been getting pressure from the higher-ups to pull back on the investigation. They want this whole thing to go away. And you," he paused, meeting her gaze. "You're in their sights." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who's putting pressure on the investigation?" Marcus exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "There are a lot of people involved in this, officers, city officials, even some business owners with close ties to the police. They're all in this together. They don't want the truth to come out because it will destroy everything they've worked for. They'll go to any lengths to shut this down. And they're not just coming after Garrett, they're coming after you." Jasmine sat back in her chair, trying to process what Marcus had just said. She had known that there would be resistance, but she hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. There were people who had built their lives and careers on the back of this system, and they were willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. Her stomach churned at the thought. How could she have known that the web of lies was so vast? How could she have anticipated the lengths to which these people would go to protect their secrets? "I can't back down now," Jasmine said, her voice resolute. "Not after everything I've uncovered. Not after everything Garrett has done. This is about more than just one bad officer. This is about the culture of the entire department. If I don't follow through, then I'm just as guilty as they are." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowing. "I know. But you need to be careful. You're playing with fire, Jazz. And the fire's getting hotter. They won't stop until you're burned." Jasmine felt a sense of foreboding settle over her, but she couldn't let it control her. She had made her decision, and now she had to see it through. But there was something else in the back of her mind, something nagging at her. It was one thing to expose a single corrupt officer, but what if the corruption ran even deeper? What if Garrett was just a small part of something much bigger? Jasmine's mind raced with the possibilities. She had to dig deeper. She had to find out who else was involved, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the days went by, Jasmine's investigation took a darker turn. She began uncovering evidence that suggested Garrett wasn't the only officer who had been involved in unethical behavior. There were patterns, officers who had been using their authority to intimidate and harass individuals, especially members of the black community. Jasmine had known this existed, but now, she had the hard proof she needed. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that what had started as a single incident was now part of a much larger, systemic issue. But the further Jasmine dug, the more she realized the risks were escalating. Her every move was being watched. Every phone call she made, every report she filed, was under scrutiny. She felt like a target, and she knew that someone was watching her every step, waiting for her to make a mistake. Jasmine had always known that the truth would come with a price. But the price was higher than she had ever anticipated. She was putting everything on the line, her career, her reputation, her safety, and for what? To expose a system that was broken? To expose a department that had failed its community for too long? But the deeper Jasmine went, the more she began to realize the truth. This was never just about her career or her safety. It was about the community. It was about the people who had been silenced for far too long. She wasn't just fighting for justice for one officer's misconduct, she was fighting for every person who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the future. And despite the fear, despite the mounting pressure, Jasmine couldn't back down now. There was too much at stake. And she was prepared to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Jasmine's resolve hardened with each passing day, but the situation had become more dangerous and complex than she ever imagined. The pressure continued to build from all sides, like a storm that could not be avoided. Her every decision, every move she made, seemed to be monitored. Even the quiet hum of the precinct now felt oppressive, as though she was being constantly watched. Her colleagues, the ones who had once stood by her, now gave her wide berth, and the whispers that followed her wherever she went were laced with distrust. Everyone was on edge, and she was at the center of it all. The case she had opened had grown beyond just one officer, Garrett. It was no longer just about his misconduct. The department itself was at risk, and some of the most powerful figures were afraid of what the full investigation might reveal. They feared the truth. The exposure of one rotten apple could lead to the unearthing of an entire barrel full of corruption. The realization hit Jasmine like a sledgehammer. She had opened a Pandora's box, and now there was no way to close it. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became, Garrett's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. The mayor's office, as Marcus had warned, was beginning to buckle under the pressure. Officials who had once claimed to stand for justice were now desperately trying to protect the city's image. Conversations that once seemed supportive of Jasmine's pursuit of justice now seemed loaded with veiled threats. They urged her to stop, to let the investigation die out, to let things go back to normal. But Jasmine knew better. She had seen how the system turned a blind eye to those who didn't matter, how it silenced the voices that needed to be heard. If she stopped now, if she let this go, nothing would change. And in the silence, more people would continue to be harmed. By the time Jasmine started receiving the anonymous threats, she had almost expected them. They came in the form of cryptic phone calls, no caller ID, a voice distorted by static, warning her to stay out of it or face the consequences. At first, Jasmine had dismissed them. She was a cop, after all, a professional trained to handle stress, intimidation, and danger. But these calls kept coming, relentless and unnerving, wearing her down bit by bit. Some of them had a cold edge to them, quiet, menacing, full of promise and menace. Others were outright taunting, as if whoever was behind them believed they had already won. They believed she would crumble, bow to the pressure. Jasmine had learned over the years that fear could be the most effective weapon against anyone, but she wasn't going to be their victim. Despite the threats, Jasmine refused to back down. She dove into the evidence with renewed urgency, her mind racing as she pieced together the web of corruption. It wasn't just Garrett. There were officers in the department, trusted officers, the ones the public relied on, who had turned a blind eye to corruption or, worse, were complicit. A network of officers who had been covering up misconduct, harassment, and abuse for years. But exposing them would not be easy, especially with the entire system closing ranks against her. Jasmine's efforts were starting to attract attention outside the department. The media had gotten wind of the investigation, and rumors were spreading like wildfire. She'd seen her name pop up in articles, some questioning her motivations, some praising her courage. But the media attention was double-edged. While it brought awareness, it also fueled the animosity. Jasmine was seen as a threat by those who had the most to lose. And the public, though largely supportive, was impatient. They wanted answers, they wanted change, but how far would they go to get it? Would they rally behind her if it all came crashing down? Everything changed one evening when Jasmine received an unexpected visitor at her office. The knock on the door was soft, tentative, but it immediately set off alarm bells in her head. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the late hour didn't sit right. She stood up cautiously, checking her surroundings before opening the door. There, standing in the hallway, was Detective Marcus Jones. His face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. Before she could say anything, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him quickly. "Jazz, you need to listen to me," Marcus said, his voice tight with panic. "This is getting out of hand. They're planning something, they're going to try and shut you down, and they won't stop until you're gone." Jasmine's heart sank. "What are you talking about? Who's they?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. "The higher-ups. There's a meeting tomorrow with some of the most powerful figures in the department, those who still have influence, and they're going to push through a decision that'll change everything. They're going to take you out of internal affairs. They're going to remove you from this case. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure you can't continue this investigation. They're going to make you a scapegoat." Jasmine's mind raced as she processed his words. She had known the consequences of continuing to push the investigation, but she hadn't expected them to be so brazen. These were people who held the reins of power, people who controlled everything from the media to public perception. They had the resources to bury the truth. "I'm not going anywhere," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the fear rising inside her. "I've come too far. I'm not backing down." Marcus shook his head. "You don't get it, Jazz. This isn't about whether or not you back down. This is about how far they'll go to protect themselves. They'll destroy you if they have to. They'll ruin your career, your reputation, everything. You need to get out of the department, at least for now. Let things cool down." Jasmine didn't want to hear it. The idea of running, of hiding in the face of this injustice, made her sick. She had never been the type to back down from a fight. The thought of abandoning everything she had worked for, everything she had uncovered, was unbearable. "I'm staying," Jasmine said firmly, looking Marcus in the eye. "If they want me out, they'll have to drag me out." Marcus didn't argue, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was worried about her, about what this would do to her. He knew, deep down, that Jasmine was about to go up against a wall of power and influence that she couldn't break on her own. But he also knew that once Jasmine set her mind to something, there was no turning back. The next morning, Jasmine's world tilted on its axis. The meeting was called, and she was summoned to attend. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew the stakes had just become even higher. When she arrived, the room was filled with figures she had only heard about in hushed tones. They were the ones who pulled the strings, the ones who had the power to destroy or protect. They sat around a massive table, their faces unreadable, their eyes cold and calculating. Jasmine took her seat, the weight of their stares heavy upon her. It felt like a battle was about to begin, a battle for her career, for justice, for everything she had ever stood for. She wasn't afraid, though. She was ready. She had made her decision, and now she would see it through. The meeting began with formalities, but it didn't take long for the tension to rise. The head of the department, Chief Andrews, spoke first, his voice authoritative and cold. "Jasmine, we've reviewed your report, and we appreciate your dedication to upholding the integrity of this department," he began, his words laced with a tone that didn't match the sentiment. "But you've crossed a line. The investigation into Officer Garrett has caused unnecessary turmoil. It's damaged the reputation of this department, and the people we serve are losing faith in us. We need to put an end to this." Jasmine's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. "The only reputation that needs fixing is the one that's been built on corruption and abuse of power," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not going to stop until the truth is exposed." Chief Andrews' eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room fell into silence. The other figures at the table exchanged glances, waiting for someone to speak. The tension was palpable. "Jasmine," Andrews continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you've been warned. But if you persist with this, if you continue to go against the department and the people who keep it running, you will be dealt with. Don't say we didn't give you a chance." Jasmine's mind was clear now. She knew what was at stake. She had already made her choice, and there was no turning back. The battle had only just begun. The day after the meeting, Jasmine felt the weight of the storm she had stepped into more than ever. The threats that had once been whispered in dark corners of the precinct were now blatant and full of venom. She couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake that would justify their efforts to take her down. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, but more than the paranoia, it was the sense of betrayal that stung the most. Colleagues who had once been her allies had either remained silent or turned against her, afraid of the consequences of standing by her. But Jasmine was unyielding. The deeper she dug into the investigation, the clearer it became that this was bigger than just her. It wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, or the handful of bad apples she had uncovered. It was a systemic issue that stretched deep into the department and beyond, corruption that had taken root so firmly that it threatened to strangle the very institution she had devoted her life to. The more Jasmine uncovered, the more desperate those in power became to silence her. That night, after hours of scouring through the evidence, she sat in her office, staring at a pile of case files scattered across her desk. It was late, past midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Her fingers traced over a set of documents that had slipped under her radar. These weren't part of the original case against Officer Garrett, but they were far more troubling. They detailed a series of cover-ups, improper arrests, and bribery involving officers from multiple precincts. She felt her pulse quicken as she skimmed through the pages. There were names here she recognized, officers who had never been questioned, never suspected. How long had this been going on? And how deep did it go? Suddenly, the shrill ring of her phone broke the silence, startling her. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the screen. The caller ID was blocked. Her stomach tightened. "Jasmine," the voice on the other end said, cold and clipped. It was one she recognized instantly. Chief Andrews. "I told you to back down," he continued, his tone laced with thinly veiled anger. "You've gone too far, and now you're dragging the entire department down with you. You have one last chance to let this go. Walk away, and we'll make sure your career isn't ruined. Keep pushing, and you'll be out. But more than that, you'll regret ever crossing us." Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hand gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles white. She wasn't afraid of his threats. If anything, they only fueled her determination. "I'm not walking away, Chief," she said firmly, her voice steady. "Not now, not ever." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Jasmine could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind, calculating his next move. Then, finally, Andrews spoke again, his voice colder than before. "You don't know what you're up against. You have no idea what's coming for you." He hung up abruptly, and Jasmine felt a chill wash over her. It wasn't the first time she had received threats, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The next few days blurred together in a haze of mounting pressure, as the walls closed in around her. Her every move was scrutinized. The department's higher-ups seemed to have more eyes on her than ever before. She couldn't even trust her own colleagues, some of whom had started to act strange, avoiding her or passing by her office without a word. Then, one fateful morning, everything changed. Jasmine had arrived at work early, as usual, hoping to get a jump start on the case before the day got too chaotic. As she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced at the screen, expecting another reminder or a routine email, but what she saw made her blood run cold. It was a news article from a local outlet. The headline read, "Internal Affairs Head Under Investigation for Unlawful Practices." Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the link, her hands shaking slightly. The article was filled with veiled accusations, but the most damaging claim was that she was somehow connected to a larger criminal syndicate, an allegation that was both completely baseless and utterly devastating. The article suggested that her investigation into Officer Garrett was part of a cover-up designed to deflect attention from her own criminal activities. The accusations were vague but carefully crafted to sow doubt in the minds of the public. Jasmine's stomach turned as she read through the entire piece. This was it. The first salvo in a full-scale campaign to destroy her reputation. She knew exactly who was behind it. Chief Andrews and his allies were making their move. Her phone rang again, and this time, it wasn't a blocked number. It was Marcus. "Jazz, you've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "I saw it," she replied, her voice tight. "They're making their move. They're going to try to take you down publicly. You need to be ready for the fallout. But I'm telling you, this isn't the end. You've got allies. People who know what you've been doing. If you fight back, if you don't back down, they can't erase you." Jasmine felt a flicker of hope at Marcus' words, but it was quickly snuffed out by the crushing weight of the situation. She knew what it meant to fight back, but fighting meant facing down some of the most powerful people in the city. It meant risking everything she had worked for, and worse, it meant putting her family in danger. "Thanks, Marcus," she said, trying to steady her breathing. "But I don't have a choice. I have to keep going." She ended the call, her mind already racing, already planning her next steps. She knew the road ahead was going to be brutal, but she also knew that it was a road she had to walk. She couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close, not when so many people were depending on her. By the time she arrived at the precinct later that day, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. There was a palpable sense of tension in the air, as if the entire building had braced itself for something. Gossip spread like wildfire, with whispers about the article and what it meant for Jasmine's future. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her as she walked past them, but she kept her head high, her face impassive. She wouldn't let them see her falter. When she entered her office, she was met by a surprise: a manila envelope, slipped under the door. No name, no return address, just a sealed envelope with a handwritten note scrawled on the front, "For your eyes only." Jasmine's pulse quickened as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an encrypted message. Her eyes narrowed as she studied it. Whoever had sent this had insider knowledge, knowledge that suggested there was someone on the inside willing to help her. As she deciphered the message, her heart raced. It was a list of names, names of officers who had been involved in the corrupt activities she had uncovered. But there was more. The message also indicated that certain high-ranking officials were planning to frame her for a crime she hadn't committed. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. This was the moment Jasmine had been waiting for. She had been given the leverage she needed. The truth was in her hands, and now it was time to expose it. But the battle was far from over. What lay ahead would test her resolve like never before. The fight was only beginning, and Jasmine knew that there would be no turning back. She had already made her choice, and now the only question was whether she could survive it. Would the system that had failed her so many times be brought to its knees, or would it succeed in crushing her under its weight? Jasmine didn't know, but one thing was certain: she would fight until her last breath.